Sometimes danger doesn't make a sound. It waits for someone who knows how to listen. The runway stretched wide under a pale winter sky, the kind of morning where everything felt too still, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath without knowing why. And pilot Daniel Hayes stepped out of the terminal with the steady, practiced calm of a man who had flown through storms most people would never understand, his boots hitting the concrete with a soft echo as the distant hum of jet engines rolled low across the airfield. A familiar sound that usually meant routine, control, safety, but today it felt different, thinner somehow, like something was missing beneath it. Beside him walked Rex, a 6-year-old police dog with a silver and tan coat that caught the early light. His posture alert yet disciplined, every step measured, every breath quiet. The kind of partner Daniel trusted more than most men. They approached the boarding stairs, ground crew moving around them, voices casual, laughter drifting lightly in the cold air, nothing out of place, nothing to explain. The sudden shift that came next, because just as Daniel placed his foot on the first metal step, Rex stopped, not hesitating, not confused, but completely still, muscles locked, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the plane, but through it, as if something unseen had reached out and held him in place. "Come on, boy," Daniel said softly, a habit more than a command. But Rex didn't move. Instead, a low vibration rolled through his chest. Not a bark, not yet. Something deeper, something older, and Daniel felt it then. That same quiet pressure pressing against his thoughts, a memory rising uninvited from years he rarely spoke about. Nights overseas when silence came before everything changed. When the air itself seemed to listen. He paused, scanning the aircraft, the smooth metal reflecting the pale sky. Nothing unusual, nothing visible. Yet Rex shifted slightly, paw pressing against the concrete, his focus dropping lower, toward the underside of the plane, and that was when Daniel noticed it, not with his eyes, but with something harder to explain, a faint rhythm, almost like a pulse hidden beneath layers of steel, so subtle it could have been ignored. But Rex didn't ignore it. He stepped forward once, then stopped again, letting out 3 short, deliberate barks that cut clean through the open air, sharp enough to turn heads, conversation stopping mid-sentence, ground crew glancing over, confused, one of them chuckling nervously. What's gotten into him? But Daniel didn't answer, because his hand had already tightened slightly at his side, his instincts pulling him backward instead of forward. And for the first time that morning, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a warning waiting to be understood. Rex did not move even as the cold wind brushed lightly across the runway. His focus locked beneath the aircraft as if the metal itself was whispering something only he could hear. And Daniel felt the shift deepen, a quiet pressure settling into his chest the way it used to before long nights overseas when nothing made sense until it was too late. One of the ground crew stepped closer, boots scraping against the concrete, trying to wave the dog off with a half-smile that did not quite hide his unease. But Rex responded with another low sound. Firmer now, not aggression, not fear, but certainty. And that was what made Daniel step back fully, his instincts overriding protocol. "Hold on," he said, voice calm but edged with something that made others pause. The kind of tone people learn not to question. The air around them seemed to thin as more eyes turned toward the plane. A mechanic crouched slightly, peering toward the landing gear, then hesitated as if unsure why he was even looking. Because nothing obvious stood out. No smoke, no sound, no visible damage. Just the same polished surface reflecting the pale sky. And yet Rex shifted again, paw pressing twice against the ground. A signal Daniel had not seen in years, not since a mission where silence had meant everything. A memory flickered through him. A narrow corridor, dust hanging in still air, a sensor pulsing in perfect intervals, and the realization that something unseen was waiting just beneath their feet. He blinked it away, grounding himself in the present. But the feeling did not leave. Instead it sharpened, pulling his attention downward, toward the space beneath the aircraft where shadows gathered in a narrow strip of darkness. "Check underneath," Daniel said, quieter now, but no less firm. The mechanic glanced at him, then at the dog, then back at the plane, uncertainty passing between them like a current, before finally kneeling down and lowering himself carefully, a flashlight clicking. on with a soft snap that echoed louder than it should have. The beam cutting through the shadowed space beneath the fuselage, illuminating metal, bolts, cables, all exactly where they should be, and for a moment, nothing happened, just the hum of distant engines and the faint whistle of wind across the tarmac, until the mechanic's hand paused mid-motion, the light shifting slightly, catching on something that did not belong, something too deliberate, too out of place to be ignored, and above. Rex stood perfectly still, ears forward, body tense, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment all along, while Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever had been hidden there had not just been found, it had been sensed long before anyone thought to look. The mechanic did not speak at first, and that silence spread upward faster than any alarm could have, his flashlight trembling slightly as the beam steadied on the object tucked deep along the inner frame. Not large, not obvious, but placed with a precision that made it impossible to ignore, and Daniel saw it in the man's posture before he heard anything, that subtle shift from routine to realization, the kind that changes the air around everyone nearby. "Sir," the mechanic finally said, voice low and tight, not fear, but something close to it, something that carried weight. And Daniel stepped closer, but not too close, his instincts holding him just outside the line where certainty turned into risk. Rex remained still beside him, no longer growling, no longer moving, as if his job had already been done the moment he forced them to stop. The dog's eyes remained fixed, not on the object, but on the space around it, as though listening for something that had not yet finished speaking. Another crew member crouched down beside the first, their shoulders nearly touching as they both leaned into the narrow shadow beneath the aircraft. The second flashlight clicked on, its beam crossing the first, revealing edges, contours, something deliberately hidden in plain sight. And for a brief second, everything felt suspended, the hum of engines fading into the background, conversations across the runway dissolving into nothing. Even the wind seemed to pause as if waiting for the moment to unfold. Daniel felt his heartbeat slow instead of rise, a strange calm settling over him, the same calm he had learned to trust years ago when hesitation meant missing the only warning you would ever get. "Back away," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not needing to, because something in the tone carried enough weight to reach everyone within earshot. The crew did not argue. They shifted backward carefully, movements controlled, deliberate, as if the space itself had become something fragile, something that needed respect. One of them lifted a hand toward his radio, hesitating for a fraction of a second before speaking into it with measured clarity, requesting additional support without explaining too much, because sometimes you did not need details to understand that something was wrong. And above them all, Rex finally relaxed his stance just slightly, his ears lowering a fraction, his breathing easing as if the unseen tension he had been tracking had begun to release. And Daniel noticed that change immediately, because it meant something had shifted, not solved, not finished, but revealed, and he looked down once more toward the underside of the aircraft, toward the place where something had been hidden with care, realizing that whatever had been placed there had not been meant to be found quickly. It had been meant to go unnoticed, to travel, to remain silent. And yet it had not accounted for one thing, not the crew, not the systems, not the routine checks, but a single presence that listened differently. And as the first distant sound of approaching security vehicles began to roll across the runway, Daniel exhaled slowly, resting his hand against Rex's neck, understanding in that quiet moment that the dog had not just stopped a flight. He had uncovered something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder across the runway, not rushed, not chaotic, but steady and controlled, the kind of movement that carried quiet authority. And as the first security team stepped out onto the concrete, the air shifted again, not with panic, but with awareness, as if everyone present had silently agreed that something unseen had crossed into their world and demanded attention. Daniel stood still beside Rex, his hand resting lightly against the dog's neck, feeling the slow, even rhythm of his breathing, a contrast to the tension that still lingered beneath the surface. One of the officers approached, his posture composed, eyes scanning the scene with trained precision before settling briefly on Rex. Then on Daniel. "What do we have?" he asked, voice calm, measured. and Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because some things were easier to understand than to explain. Instead, he nodded slightly toward the underside of the aircraft, where the two mechanics had stepped back, leaving the space open, almost respectfully, as if whatever lay there required distance. The officer crouched, another beside him, their movements deliberate, unhurried, a small inspection. Mirror extended, a flashlight beam angled carefully, and for a moment, nothing changed, just the low hum of engines and the faint echo of footsteps across the tarmac. But then one of the officers paused, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the equipment, and even from several feet away, Daniel could feel it, that same invisible line being crossed again, the moment when uncertainty becomes understanding. Rex shifted beside him, not tense this time, but attentive, as though confirming something already known, his ears flicking once toward the plane, then settling back, the earlier urgency now replaced with a quiet watchfulness. And Daniel recognized that change, because it meant the unknown was no longer hidden. It had a shape now, a presence, something that could be seen and handled, though not yet fully understood. The officer slowly stood, turning slightly as he spoke into his radio in a voice that remained calm, but carried an unmistakable weight, requesting a specialized unit without raising alarm, because sometimes the situation required precision more than speed. And as those words carried across the open space, the ground crew instinctively took another step back, giving more room, creating a wider circle of quiet around the aircraft. Daniel glanced once more at the plane, its surface unchanged, still reflecting the pale sky as if nothing had ever been wrong. And yet everything had shifted beneath it, hidden just out of sight until a single instinct refused to ignore it. He looked down at Rex, whose gaze had finally softened, the sharp edge of focus replaced by a calm that only came after the truth had been uncovered. And Daniel understood then that whatever had been placed beneath that aircraft had relied on routine, on assumption, on the simple belief that no one would look closely enough to notice, but it had not accounted for presence, for awareness, for the quiet partnership between a man who had learned to listen to silence and a dog who had never stopped hearing it. And as the distant sound of additional units approached, rolling steadily across the runway, Daniel remained where he was, not moving forward, not stepping away, simply standing in that narrow space between what had almost happened and what had just been prevented, knowing that some moments do not arrive with noise or warning, they arrive quietly, waiting for someone willing to notice before it is too late. The specialized unit arrived without urgency, but with precision, their vehicle rolling to a controlled stop as if even the movement itself was measured, and the team stepped out carrying equipment that did not look dramatic, but carried a quiet authority, the kind that did not need to announce its purpose. The lead technician nodded once toward the officers already on scene, then lowered himself toward the underside of the aircraft, movements slow and deliberate, every gesture intentional, as if rushing would mean missing something important. Daniel watched from a few yards away, his posture steady, his eyes following the subtle details rather than the obvious ones, because he had learned long ago that truth rarely revealed itself in loud ways. Beside him, Rex remained calm, his body no longer rigid but still alert, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the same hidden space, as if confirming that whatever had drawn his attention had not disappeared. The technician adjusted a small sensor device, placing it near the area that had been identified. The screen flickered softly, numbers shifting in quiet patterns that meant little to most people, but everything to those trained to read them. Another team member extended a narrow camera beneath the frame, the live feed appearing on a handheld monitor, revealing the confined space in greater detail, edges, surfaces, and then that same object, now clearer, still small, still carefully positioned, but undeniably out of place. A presence that did not belong to the structure it was attached to. The technician exhaled slowly, not in alarm, but in recognition, and he raised a hand slightly, signaling for more space without needing to speak. The circle around the aircraft widened again, footsteps soft against the concrete, voices lowered instinctively, as if the entire scene had shifted into a quieter frequency, where even sound felt like it needed permission. Daniel felt the same stillness settle deeper, not fear, but awareness, the kind that sharpened everything. He glanced once at the horizon where the pale sky stretched endlessly, then back to the aircraft that now seemed different, no longer just a machine, but a place where something hidden had tried to pass unnoticed, and yet had been stopped by something even quieter. The technician began a careful process, hands steady, movements precise, working not against the object but around it, as if respecting the fact that understanding came before action. And during that time Rex lowered himself slowly to the ground, resting but not sleeping, his eyes half open, still watching, still listening. Daniel knelt beside him, his hand resting gently along the dog's shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, grounding himself in that simple connection. "You knew," he murmured softly, not expecting a response, but understanding that some things did not need words. The dog's ear flicked slightly at the sound of his voice, but his focus remained outward, toward the space where everything had shifted, and after several long moments that felt both stretched and suspended, the technician finally leaned back, nodding once to the officer beside him, a quiet confirmation that something had indeed been there, something intentional, something placed with purpose, and though the exact nature of it would be handled carefully, explained later, documented in ways that would make sense on paper, Daniel already understood the part that mattered most, that this moment had not been about what was found, but about how it was found. And as the team continued their work with calm precision, the runway remained quiet around them, the hum of engines distant now, almost irrelevant, because in that space between departure and delay, something far more important had taken place, a quiet intervention that no one had planned and no system had predicted, except for the one that listened differently, the one that had refused to move when everything else said it was time to go. Time seemed to slow as the work beneath the aircraft continued, not in the way of urgency, but in the way of focus, where every second stretched just enough to be noticed. And Daniel remained kneeling beside Rex, his hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder, as if anchoring himself to something steady, while everything else quietly shifted around them. The specialized team moved with careful coordination, their voices low, their gestures precise, each action guided not by haste but by understanding. And as the object was gradually secured and isolated, the tension that had once filled the air began to change shape, no longer sharp or uncertain, but settling into something quieter, something reflective. Rex exhaled slowly, his body easing further into the ground, though his eyes never fully closed, still tracking the subtle movements around the aircraft as if ensuring that nothing had been missed. Daniel noticed that, the dog did not simply react, but remained present even after the moment had passed, and it reminded him of something he had not thought about in years, the long stretches of waiting during his service, when the mission was not just about action but about staying aware long after the immediate danger had faded. "It is never just the moment," an old instructor had once told him. "It is what comes after that defines whether you truly understood it." And standing there now, Daniel realized how much of that lesson lived quietly inside him, reflected in the way he watched, the way he listened, and perhaps most clearly in the way Rex had responded before anyone else even knew there was something to respond to. One of the officers approached again, his posture still composed, but his eyes carrying a deeper acknowledgement now, not just of the situation, but of the presence that had revealed it. He glanced briefly at Rex, then at Daniel, offering a small nod that did not need words to be understood, because some recognitions existed beyond explanation. The aircraft itself stood unchanged, its exterior still smooth and silent beneath the pale sky, yet everything about it felt different now, as if it carried a story that had almost gone unnoticed, a path that had nearly continued without interruption. And Daniel stood slowly, brushing his hands together out of habit, though there was no dust to clear, his gaze lifting once more to the length of the plane, tracing its outline from nose to tail, imagining for a brief moment what might have happened if Rex had not stopped, if the routine had continued uninterrupted, if the quiet signal had been ignored. But he did not dwell on it, because that was not where his focus belonged. Instead, he looked down at Rex, who now met his gaze with a calm that felt almost knowing. Not proud, not seeking praise, simply present. And Daniel felt a faint shift inside himself, something subtle but real, a recognition that not all warnings come with noise, not all truths announce themselves. Some arrive in stillness, in hesitation, in a refusal to move when everything else says you should. And as the team beneath the aircraft completed their careful work and began to step back, the space around them slowly returned to motion, voices rising slightly, footsteps resuming their rhythm, the distant hum of engines growing clearer again. Yet for Daniel, the moment remained suspended just beneath the surface, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop, listen, and trust what cannot yet be explained. The runway slowly began to breathe again as movement returned in careful layers, not all at once but piece by piece, like a world resuming after holding still for too long. And the aircraft remained where it was, grounded not by failure but by discovery, its departure quietly postponed as the unseen story beneath it continued to unfold. Daniel stood with his hands at his sides, no longer tense, no longer searching, but aware in a deeper way, the kind that lingers after something important has passed. The specialized team secured their equipment with the same calm precision they had arrived with, their work nearly complete, though the meaning of what they had found would carry far beyond this moment. An officer approached Daniel once more, this time with a different expression, not just professional, but thoughtful, as if recognizing something that could not be written into a report. "Your dog," he said quietly, glancing toward Rex. He caught something none of us would have seen in time. Daniel gave a small nod, not out of pride, but understanding, because he knew it was not about skill alone. It was about presence, about the ability to notice when something in the world shifted just slightly out of place. Rex stood up slowly, stretching his legs, his body language calm, almost ordinary now, as if the weight of the moment had already passed through him, leaving no trace except the quiet certainty that he had done what needed to be done. Daniel rested his hand briefly along the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding, familiar, real. Around them the ground crew resumed their tasks, though more slowly now, more aware, conversations softer, movements more deliberate, as if everyone carried a subtle understanding that not everything could be seen at a glance, that sometimes the most important things were hidden just beneath the surface. The plane's engines had gone silent, the low hum replaced by a deeper stillness that felt almost reflective. Daniel looked out across the runway, the wide stretch of concrete fading into the horizon, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the path that would have continued if nothing had interrupted it, the flight lifting into the sky, the miles passing unnoticed, the quiet remaining unbroken. But he let that thought go just as quickly as it came, because what mattered was not what could have happened, but what had been prevented. The officer gave one last nod before stepping away, his attention shifting back to the ongoing work, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension fully leaving his shoulders now, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, a recognition that this moment would not be remembered for what was found, but for how it was discovered, through a pause, a refusal, a single instinct that chose not to move forward when everything else said it was time. Rex glanced up at him briefly, eyes calm, present, then turned his attention outward again, as if already ready for whatever came next, and Daniel understood that too. Because some partnerships are not built on words or explanations, but on trust, on the quiet understanding that when one senses something the other does not, you stop, you listen, and you believe, even if the reason has not yet revealed itself. And as the morning light continued to stretch across the runway, soft and pale, Daniel remained there for a moment longer, not waiting, not wondering, just standing in the quiet space where something unseen had been brought into the light, knowing that sometimes the difference between an ordinary day and something else entirely comes down to a single moment when someone chooses to pause instead of proceed. The final pieces were handled with a quiet precision that seemed almost ceremonial, as if everyone present understood that what had been uncovered was not just an object, but a moment that could have passed unnoticed, the specialized team carefully securing it within a contained unit, their movement steady, respectful, and once it was removed from beneath the aircraft, the space it had occupied felt strangely empty, not just physically, but in a way that made the air itself seem lighter, as though something unseen had finally released its hold. Daniel watched without stepping closer, his distance intentional, not out of fear but out of understanding, because some things did not need to be approached to be understood. Rex remained beside him, now fully at ease, his posture relaxed, his tail resting quietly against the ground, the sharp focus from earlier replaced by a calm awareness that signaled completion. The work was done. Whatever had drawn his attention had been found and taken away, and for the first time since the moment had begun, the runway sounded normal again. Engines humming in the distance, voices returning to their usual rhythm, footsteps moving with purpose rather than hesitation. Yet beneath that return to routine, something subtle had changed. Daniel could feel it in the way people moved, a slight pause before action, a brief glance where none had been before, as if the memory of what had just happened lingered just below the surface. The officer returned once more, this time with a quiet confirmation, a few words exchanged that carried meaning without detail. The situation had been handled, the risk removed. The aircraft would remain grounded for further inspection, procedures would follow, reports would be written. But none of that seemed to matter as much as the simple truth that it had been noticed in time. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the words without needing more, his attention drifting back to Rex, who had now lifted his head slightly, eyes meeting his with a calm that felt almost reflective, not questioning, not seeking approval, just present. And Daniel felt something settle inside him, a quiet clarity that did not come from explanation, but from experience. From knowing that not every answer arrives in a way that can be measured or defined. Some arrive in instincts, in pauses, in moments where something inside you says wait. Even when everything around you says go. He reached down and rested his hand gently along Rex's neck, fingers brushing through the thick fur. A simple gesture, but one that carried everything that needed to be said. Good call, he murmured softly, the words barely louder than the wind moving across the open space, and Rex blinked slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than the words themselves. The sun had risen higher now, casting a soft light across the runway, warming the cold edges of the morning, and the aircraft stood quietly in that light, no longer just a machine ready for departure, but a place where something hidden had been brought into the open, a reminder that even in the most routine moments, there are layers unseen, waiting. And as Daniel finally turned slightly, preparing to step away from the scene, he paused for just a second longer, looking back not at what had been found, but at the space where it had once been hidden, understanding that sometimes the most important part of a story is not what is discovered, but the moment someone chooses to look closely enough to find it. By the time the runway returned fully to its rhythm, the moment had already begun to settle into something quieter, something that did not fade but instead lingered beneath the surface like a memory waiting to be understood. The aircraft remained grounded for now, its departure delayed not by failure, but by a pause that had come at exactly the right time. Daniel walked slowly along the edge of the tarmac with Rex beside him, the early morning light stretching across the concrete in long, pale lines that softened everything it touched. The noise of engines and distant announcements had returned, but it no longer felt the same, as if the day itself had shifted just slightly, carrying with it the echo of what had almost gone unnoticed. Rex moved with a calm, steady gait, no longer searching, no longer alert in the way he had been before, simply present, as though whatever he had sensed had already passed through him and left no burden behind. Daniel glanced down at him, a faint, thoughtful expression crossing his face, not one of relief, not exactly, but something deeper, a quiet recognition that trust is not always built on understanding. Sometimes it is built on the willingness to listen when there is no clear reason to. They reached a quieter stretch of the airfield, away from the cluster of activity, where the wind moved more freely and the sounds softened into a distant hum. Daniel stopped there for a moment, looking out toward the open sky, vast and uninterrupted, the kind of sky he had spent years navigating, believing that everything important could be measured, calculated, controlled, but today had reminded him of something else entirely, something less visible but no less real. He crouched down beside Rex, resting his forearms loosely against his knees, his gaze meeting the dog's steady eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them not empty, but full, carrying everything that had happened without needing to be spoken. "You felt it before I did," Daniel said quietly, his voice calm, almost reflective, and Rex blinked once, slow and unhurried, As if acknowledging something beyond words, the wind shifted slightly, brushing across the open space, and Daniel let out a slow breath, feeling the last of the tension leave him completely, replaced by something steadier, something grounded. He reached out and gently brushed his hand along Rex's neck, a simple gesture, but one that carried trust, respect, and something close to gratitude. Around them the world continued as it always did, planes prepared for departure, crews moved with purpose, announcements echoed faintly through the air, but beneath all of it, there remained that quiet understanding that not every danger arrives loudly, not every truth is visible. Some are hidden in the spaces people rarely look, waiting for someone willing to notice. And as Daniel finally stood again, turning slightly back toward the runway, he carried that awareness with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions are not the ones you make when everything is clear, but the ones you make when something inside you tells you to pause, to listen, to trust what you cannot yet explain. And beside him, Rex walked forward without hesitation, steady and calm, as if the path ahead was once again simple, because for him, it always had been: listen, respond, and move only when it felt right. And as they disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the morning, the moment they had shared remained behind, not as something dramatic or loud, but as something far more powerful, a quiet interruption that changed everything simply because it was noticed in time.